You are listening to the Roberta Glass True Crime Report, putting the true back in true crime. From New York City, Roberta Glass is now on the record.
Hi, everybody. I hope you're having a good week. Nadia, who I met at the Ghislaine Maxwell trial, has started a terrific new substack, which I hope will all subscribe to. The link is in this episode's description. Please subscribe and support her work. So Nadia, she has done an interview with me, and it is like a very compacted, very dense ABCs of Innocence Fraud. She did a terrific job editing this. This is part 1 of the interview, and I will release part 2 on this channel and this platform when it comes out. So keep an eye out for that. I was trying to really encapsulate, and I don't know how well I did in this podcast, what Innocence Fraud is about, how it works, and you can hear Nadia in it really clarifying. You can hear her background as a teacher in this, really clarifying what it is, how it works, exactly the mechanics of it. And here's the first part of her 2-part interview with me, and she wrote a really nice, flattering introduction. I first met Roberta over a year ago at the Ghislaine Maxwell trial. It was the first time I had watched a trial in person. But for Roberta, it was nothing new. She had been at the courthouse for the NXIVM trial and Larry Ray trial. She had also researched and read the court documents and transcripts for numerous other ones as well, all covered in her true crime podcast. Her knowledge was most evident on days when I would find myself lost and confused listening to the lawyers argue. But Roberta was able to follow along and explain what was going on to me. Roberta was the one who had introduced me to the Innocence Fraud movement. To explain this movement, it is a grift. Organizations such as the Innocence Project have a team of lawyers represent convicted murderers years after their verdict and try to have that conviction overturned. In the process, they make a profit from the media and from the civil lawsuits against the city. When I first met Nadia at the Ghislaine Maxwell trial, I'm always nervous when it finally comes around to the subject of what your podcast is about. I say Innocence Fraud. I can remember Lisa Bloom at the Ghislaine Maxwell trial moving away from me at the bench. I really liked her, but sort of recoiling as a civil lawyer would, because, of course, in the civil suits, that's where the innocence movement makes their money. Or if you've been indoctrinated into the idea that our legal system is so unfair from pretty much every American media, I often get resistance. Really? What? Are you sure this is going on? I've never heard of this kind of thing. But Nadia got it right away. And she's a very quick study and was very interested. And without further ado, I think she did a great job with this podcast. Take a listen.
Roberta, welcome. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. My pleasure.
So my first question is, how did you get into true crime, and how did you learn about the Innocence Fraud movement?
Well, I was always a true crime fan from the Menendez case when I was in college, and that was the first case I really just got into, and I just could not believe the fervor of Eric Menendez's lawyer, Leslie Abramson. And I got fascinated by the theatrics and the drama of it. And also that I had been a swimmer, competitive swimmer, and that the Menendez brothers had lived near me. And I thought, well, maybe I'd swum with it. I sort of felt like I had some sort of understanding of the case or connection to the case through the swimming thing. And I would read Dominic Dunn. I'm still a giant fan of Dominic Dunn. All his court reporting at Vanity Fair, as soon as it was come out, I would go grab the magazine and go through it. And then in 2012, I was in a fire and I got saved by some firemen, and I felt like I was breathing what would be my last breath. And that gave me a connection while I was recovering. It was a long recovery, to true crime that I never had before, that I felt that I could understand the victim's perspective in a very immediate and real way from that experience. And that gave me a little bit of a different perspective. And that was right around the time the West Memphis Three, who I had seen these movies, I always thought they were innocent. I was very excited that they were getting out of prison on this Alford plea. I didn't really understand the Alford plea, but they had this press conference. They had to take this guilty plea. They're very innocent, and it was sort of just hammered home by the press that these were innocent guys. And right around that time, I heard a podcast. Ed Opperman's podcast was on this West Memphis Three, and he was saying they were guilty. And I had never, ever heard that perspective before. And that sent me in reading the court transcripts and reading the other side of things. So then I started to look into other cases like Richard Glossop and starting to see similarities between the West Memphis Three, Richard Glossop. And then finally, I came across Martin Pribe's blog, which was called FOP, meaning Fraternal Order of police officer and a writer. And he was writing all about the innocence fraud cases in Chicago, one after another. And he was writing about it with a name called Innocence Fraud, writing about innocence fraud, just one case after the next. And I said, oh my gosh, what I've discovered isn't an anomaly. It's a massive wave of innocence fraud. I've always been very careful to try to keep an open mind with any case that I investigate, but I have looked at every celebrated innocence fraud case that the Innocence Project and the wrongful conviction movement in general has put out. And one is more ridiculous than the next. One is more obvious case of guilt than the next. I have not found one case of innocence in the 5 years that I've been looking at this.
We have to explain what this innocence fraud movement is, but one of the main characteristics of it is the fact that they completely overlook the actual victim. And all the focus is on that murderer versus the victim who has been completely forgotten.
So when I say I'm looking at these cases, a good innocence fraud campaign does not start till 14 years after the conviction. And that's a really important point because you have to completely obscure the victim. You have to obscure the horror of the crime. And then you have to make the victimizer now is the victim. And that's what you're going to focus on. His unfair trial, his tunnel vision investigation by the police, his unfair trial. It's not only gone through the jury, our jury courts, it's also gone through the appeals court. And usually at 14 years, they've gone through many appeals courts, have gone through this case with a fine-tooth comb and affirmed the conviction, so affirmed guilt. So when I say that these cases are ridiculous, they're rightfully ridiculous because they've been so looked at carefully by our court system and our juries. It's not unusual that every appeals court has turned them down because this person is extremely guilty.
Let's talk about exactly what this innocence fraud movement is. It's basically people who are guilty. They're being represented by these innocence groups and these organizations such as the Innocence Project. And these convicted murderers, they have documentaries, they have podcasts made about them. They have the media reporting on their cases. But the problem with all of this attention that they're getting is that these reports are not including a lot of the facts from the trial. They're not including the evidence. They have their own narrative. And the problem with this narrative, too, is that it's designed to provoke this emotional response from the audience as they are leaving out evidence. And so one of the things that they like to use is racism, for instance. It was because it was an all-white jury. That is why they were found guilty.
The defense has to agree on the jury, and so does the prosecution. So that if that was an all-white jury, then it was picked by the defense and the prosecution because they felt that those people could be impartial.
They also use a tactic of false confessions to say that these convicted murderers, killers, were forced into a confession.
The idea of a false confession, or the concept of it, is that it's a rare thing that happens and there's all sorts of different risk factors for false confessions. Low IQ, extreme pressure, withholding food and water, things like that. But now the wrongful conviction movement has a new concept, like false confessions, meaning plural. So the idea of the Central Park Five, 4 out of the 5 confessed, and you can watch those on tape. They're being offered Cokes, their parents are sitting next to them. And then all the people on the periphery who took plea deals, one just had their conviction vacated ridiculously. Because what I'm saying is there's so many confessions all around that are all consistent around this one crime. Now we're supposed to believe that four people and more are going to falsely confess under none of those kind of having none of those kind of risk factors, or very few. But logical sense goes out the window. And you make a great point about our press. The defense or the convicted killers' lawyers will hand the press their talking points, and it will be all written out for them. Here's the case. Here's all the things that you can talk about in your article. But the prosecution is usually busy trying other cases. They're not going to have some kind of talking points, PR ready points. But the Innocence Project, wrongful conviction movement is so rich that they can have special people who liaison with these journalists, and it's all set for them. So it takes a really disciplined journalist to dig into these court transcripts. And usually they're on a time schedule. And usually what we get in our press, in our mainstream press, also because they're politically aligned with this ideology that our justice system is so unfair. So we get this situation where the West Memphis Three have had zero factual articles written about them in our mainstream media, which is really sad. Everything that's factual about that case is going to be in small sites, what my mother would call fringe media, which isn't very well respected, which is a problem.
And one of the issues too is because the average everyday person, they don't have time to look through all of these transcripts from the trial. So they do rely on the media to get their facts. But the problem is the media is so biased.
And we don't even know the real connections between these journalists and these defense attorneys. There was one case, there was a journalist called Nicholas Schmidl who wrote for the New Yorker, the Chicago case, Tyrone Hood case, where they were in litigation, and Nicholas Schmidl, who wrote this love letter piece to Tyrone Hood, and very factually inaccurate, they asked him, they wanted to bring him into a deposition and find out, were you paid for that New Yorker piece? What were your connections with the defendant, with the convicted killer's defense attorney? Were you getting paid? All those things could have been answered in a deposition, but he avoided the deposition, never answered his subpoena to give a deposition, and avoided it. So we'll never know.
And I think one of the issues too is a lot of people don't even know where they should look for this information. I mean, we met at the Ghislaine Maxwell trial, and I didn't even know that trials could actually be attended by the public. So I think that is one of the
I just had my doctor tell me that. She goes, well, how do you get in? I said, we have open court. A doctor, running a department. So it's not the uninformed that are thinking this. I think many people don't know that our courts are open in this country, and anyone can just walk in and watch any trial that they want. Or night court. I am always encouraging my audience to go to night court, to go to trial, to watch our justice system unfold in real time. Otherwise, I think the public has this impression that things are very hurried in our courts, and that big mistakes could happen. But when you go to court, I think you would agree with this, you realize how slowly things are evaluated, and how slow everything takes, and how carefully everything is gone through. And evidence has to be accepted on both sides. It's a long, long process, rightfully so. And it should be that way. And there's a weird thing that happens when you're in court, when you hear the truth, when you hear someone talk and then you hear them cross-examined, and that's why cross-examination is often called the engine of truth. It's like you can see very clearly what's true and what's untrue during cross-examination. I'm not saying that it's above being manipulated or theatrics being added, but generally in cross-examination, you can have a sense of what happened, what's true and what's not true.
With this fraud movement, so their goal isn't to tell the truth about these criminals or the crimes that they committed, but instead they want everyone to be outraged at the justice system. And they want you to believe that this criminal is the underdog going up against the man.
This is a multi-billion-dollar movement. So you have to think that this, with the ACLU, the anti-death penalty movement is behind it, all the different wrongful conviction movement charities. This is a multi-billion-dollar movement. And it's making a lot of money. And how they make money, how is this movement making people money? Well, it's making people money in Hollywood. And it's also, you're on a short list for awards if you write about a wrongfully convicted killer. Oh, right, my God. Sarah Koenig, who got a Peabody Award for Serial, which is, I consider that an Innocence Fraud podcast. It's one of the biggest podcasts in the world at the time. And it eventually got Adnan Syed, Hae-Min Lee's killer, released. Mm-hmm. So that they make money on the Hollywood side. Then what they do, once they put enough pressure on our justice system to somehow get these people out, then they sue civilly. Mm-hmm. So usually what they do is they go from court to court to court to court. Sometimes they get they get turned down sometimes multiple times, and they get one person to say yes, just like a guy asking 1 million girls out on a date. One of them is going to say yes. So they get them out. Then they sue in our civil courts, where the bar of evidence is much lower. The judge isn't familiar with the case. Nobody knows about the case. They throw their line on the court and they get these big multi-million-dollar judgments. Sometimes they sue the police, and a lot of times the police go, oh, well, it'll cost us more to fight this than it will to just pay them out. So they pay them out. It's like feeding pigeons. They just come back for more. This is a movement that will never give up. There's no punishment on the line. The only thing that's on the line is who's going to pay, is money. That's how our civil courts work. This movement, which started out as an ideology, which is that a very, very radical left ideology, that there's something inherently racist or systematically unfair about our system, and that all these convicted killers are just little guys caught up in it, and we got to get them released. So it started out with those kind of people, the People's Law Office in Chicago. Chicago is really the center of this innocence fraud movement. I don't think there's a city that has more innocence fraud going on, more innocence fraud cases than Chicago. Blue cities, it tends to really prosper, but they're also trying to go to Oklahoma and more conservative cities now too, cities where there's the death penalty.
So basically, these civil suits, they sue the city, they sue the police department, as you mentioned earlier, and they end up having these multi-million-dollar payouts for this.
The Central Park Five wanted $40 million. They got $20 million. Martin Pribe has correctly said, he sums it up as they turn the cops into criminals and the criminals into folk heroes. Their pet killer, or a bunch of their pet killers, they will create this thing called a pattern in practice. So if they get off on, they skate by, and they basically it's organized fraud, organized crime. That's what innocence fraud is. So basically, if they can get one of their killers out and declare them innocent to the press, they can say, well, this detective was involved in this one, and that creates a pattern and practice of the detective singling out innocent people or having tunnel vision. It's absolutely criminalizing the police, and they usually go after people who are really good at their jobs. It is so perverse. They seem to go after the most deranged and dangerous people and to make them heroes. And as
the Central Park Five, it was an agreement between city law department and the five men.
Yusuf Salam told the police officer that hitting the jogger, Trisha Melee, hitting her over the head with a brick was fun. That will tell you the kind of people. And that's the person that Obama gave a Lifetime Achievement Award to, Yusuf Salam. This woman basically beating her to death. She lost 75% of her blood, raping her. That was really fun. That's who we're honoring as a hero.
Another interesting thing, too, especially with the Central Park Five, is the celebrities who get involved with these movements. Like you have Kim Kardashian.
Right, supported Julius Jones. She supported Purvis Payne, which is one of the most disturbing cases. A guy who raped and killed a mama and tried to kill her two babies, killed the daughter and left the son for dead. He had to hold his intestines to the hospital. She supported Purvis Payne, and he was caught running from the scene covered in blood, ran into a police officer. How much more guilty do you have to be?
Mm-hmm.
Then they found him hiding in an attic after he murdered this woman. He left his fingerprints, his DNA all over the thing. They tested the knife again. It comes back with his DNA. That's another important thing, is when they always push for testing the DNA because that's one of their big tricks, is that when the DNA isn't there, they just declare innocence and all the rest of the evidence goes out the window. Payne or Julius Jones, when they said, we just have to test the bandana, when it comes back with their client's DNA, they do not walk away. They just double down on innocence and spin it. So that with Purvis Payne, they found some unidentifiable, meaning it will never be, it's incomplete DNA, never be attached to anyone, probably just hanging around on this kitchen knife that he used to murder Sharice Christopher. They had the press declaring him innocent because of his incomplete DNA. And the press ignored that his DNA was found on the handle of the knife. But again, another sign of guilt. It should have been case closed. And that guy gets his death penalty sentence commuted for nothing. They said they eventually went with he was too stupid to kill, meaning he was too low IQ to kill. That's what they eventually went with.
That they like to use as well. Say that this person's not fit for trial, either from insanity or because their IQ is too low.
Right.
So they couldn't even comprehend exactly what they were doing when they were committing the crime. What is the motivation? Because we're starting to see this more often with all of these DAs letting these criminals go.
So Soros and George Gascon, the DA of Los Angeles, had this brilliant idea that they create a super PAC of $50 million called the Equal Justice Initiative, and that they would run former defense attorneys as for district attorney. So they would get in and there would be no opposition. So what you have in LA and other blue cities like Ann Arbor, Michigan, is you have two defense attorneys talking to themselves in court. And there is no one representing the victim. And it's all about the convicted killer and what they can do for him. And that's how Marilyn Mosby worked in Baltimore. She let out Adnan Syed on a bunch of really ridiculous evidence. One was the DNA on Haymon Lee's shoes, which is, as Sean Fitzgerald, who has the Actual Justice Warrior YouTube channel, friend of mine points out, is that when you do take a forensics class, one of the first things you do is test the DNA on your shoes to see how much DNA is on your shoes, to see how much you pick up. And it's this idea that we have that DNA is somehow the gold standard. But if you go to a bank and your hair is left at a bank and the bank gets robbed tomorrow, your hair is there, your DNA is there, did you rob that bank? Or was that just some DNA left there? People don't think like that. They always think that whoever leaves the DNA there last, that there's somehow kind of like a time stamp, or any DNA found is going to have to be connected to the crime, and that's not how it works.
And meanwhile, wasn't there about 30 million different DNA samples found on that shoe?
Yes. And one of the most hilarious parts of that Adnan Syed thing, if it weren't so tragic for Haymon Lee's family and for our justice system and for fairness in general, is that one of the things that they put up as a new suspect was actually a mentor of Adnan Syed's, describing Adnan Syed harassing Haymon Lee. So one of these new suspects was Adnan Syed himself, that they used to release Adnan Syed.
And it's unfortunate because especially with this Adnan Syed, his victim's family didn't even know about the retrial. Yeah,
it was horrible. They told them that, could be a hearing, but maybe you'd want to come. Not that you have a right to be there. They didn't tell the victim, Haymon Lee's brother, that he had the right to be there and that they were going to let out Adnan Syed. They just said it was a hearing. And he was used to the DA looking after the victim's interests, because now it's Marilyn Mosby, whose whole entire interest is with Adnan Syed and his family. There's no one there looking after the victim's family. And that's why there is a lawsuit about the way that Adnan Syed was released. What's going to become of that lawsuit is going to be very interesting. And don't expect mainstream media coverage on it. And to see the few people, mostly everybody was confused, but to see the few people who knew it was a fraud and not saying anything was very disappointing, to see our media so silent.
And even if you look at the comments for all the articles that are being written for it, everyone is cheering on for his release.
He does have real supporters. They're usually people who are very young, who haven't lived life, who have no BS meter. That's something that you really need, is just a basic BS meter in life. Mm-hmm. I interviewed John Lewin, who was, I think, one of the greatest trial attorneys ever. He prosecuted Robert Durst. He's known as the king of the cold cases. He's now been exiled by George Gascon for speaking out against his pro-criminal policies. But what he said, I never want any actors or actresses on my jury. Why no actors? He says, because they always want the unusual. I just want a jury to look at the evidence I presented and not think, what if something very improbable might have happened? What if there's a 0.0001% chance that, I don't know, an alien came down from outer space and shot him or whatever? He said that's the kind of mindset of an actor or an actress. They want the unusual. And I think that is very similar characteristic with these people in the wrongful conviction movement. They tend to be really young. They have these ideas about our justice system that maybe things move very fastly. They can't be very quickly. They can't be ironed out in time, that we need the Innocence Project to make it right. But the Innocence Project has gotten bolder and bolder with their lies every year, in my opinion, as they've gone on. And they've just been lying. There's nobody with an equally big platform to kind of pull the reins or fact check them. And to have someone come along and say, oh, well, you just declare guilt very quickly without any work. It takes a lot of work to go through all these court documents and appeals cases. And that's why our journalists aren't doing it. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of time. And there's no money in it.